Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. Sorry for being a bit late. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour. I am Yves Engler, and I'm going to I'm coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. And there's been a lot of developments in Canadian foreign policy this week, so I'll get right to it. I hope everyone's doing well here in Montreal. It's very nice, nice weather. So look like we're past the spring and on to there's a video. Let's see. Okay, so I think people can put their videos on now. So that's probably part of the problem that developed. I see the big problem here. I got rid of that previously. Okay, well, that explains my earlier problem. Am I spotlighted for everyone? Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, there should be a petition around Canada signing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons put in the chat so people can sign that. So I thought I'd start off with Ecuador. The president abolished Congress and is going to rule for up to 6 months by decree. He made this in response to Congress seeking to impeach him. They had the votes, and what's notable about this is the reaction, right? So this same thing happened, variation has happened in Peru about 6 months ago. And in that case, the Canadian government, US government, number of other governments came out right away and said this was a coup attempt and blamed, when Pedro Castillo was ousted, they blamed him for undermining democracy. And in the case of Ecuador, because Lasso is a right-wing president that the Canadian government has been backing, of course, now those rules are out the window, and it's, what he's doing is fine, it's constitutional. And Evo Morales, the former Bolivian president, pointed this out on Twitter, that this would have been called a coup by Castillo 6 months ago. The US government put out a statement saying the government of the United States respects the internal and constitutional process of Ecuador. We will continue working with the constitutional government, civil society, the private sector, and the Ecuadorian people. Yes, so they basically endorse what happened. There will be elections in 3 months, but that was actually part of Castillo's thing, was to have elections as well. I didn't find a comment from the Canadian government. What I did find is a statement from a couple of days ago, acting as all is the same, with it was titled from from the Trade Ministry, titled Minister Neg celebrates Ecuador and Costa Rica for advancing women's economic empowerment. So from Canada's industry minister. And a couple months ago, Canadian Dimension published an article titled "As Lasso Flails, Ottawa Pushes for More Canadian Mining in Ecuador." And that story talked about how Canada was trying to sign a free trade agreement with Ecuador. So you really see that. I mean, it further confirms that the process in Peru was very much a coup, where you see the difference of how the US and Canadian government react depending on the politics of the official that is making different measures. The climate crisis, as we're seeing, obviously, with the forest fires in Alberta and stories flooding in Italy and whatnot, it's ramping up. There's a report came out that we're going to pass the 1.5 degree threshold by 2027. The Science has published a paper saying that Africans born in 2020 will have 51 times more experiences of heat waves than people born a few decades previous. So this is, again, in this case, this is people who are who, countries that are historically responsible for a very small amount of greenhouse gas emissions being hit by the brunt of the climate crisis. The Trudeau government, there was a report 5 days ago titled "Liberals Downgrade Africa Strategy to Framework, but Insist Continent is a Priority." So they previously announced they were going to do some sort of Africa strategy like the Indo-Pacific strategy, and now they, as part of basically saying they're not taking it that seriously, they're downgrading it to a framework, which is just a sort of effectively what this means is sort of, I think, code word in Global Affairs Canada, and to sort of, what we're actually prioritizing. Obviously, anyone who knows anything knows they're prioritizing the competition with China rather than different dynamics on the African continent. Now, the sort of liberal types kind of complain that this was like a bad thing. I'm not so sure. I'm always of the opinion that it would be better if Canada just ignored, the African continent. That would be for a net benefit. I'd say in about half of all African countries, Canada's top priority is just the profits of mining companies. That's pretty much all they do, is work on ways to enable the profits of Canadian mining companies. There are some countries where there's geostrategic, there's some military relationships, there's some other there are some other economic, beyond mining, other economic relations. Obviously, there's Canadian aid. That's wildly exaggerated how significant that is, and how much that's about, helping. So downgrading it from a strategy to a framework, I'm not sure if that's a good or bad thing, but that is what the Liberal government has decided to do. The big report, or the big announcement from the I'm not sure what the exact title was, but the special rapporteur or whatever to the government to look at foreign interference, David Johnson, the former Governor General, they're going to put their strategy out. He's going to release it tomorrow. Everyone expects that he's going to announce a public inquiry or something, if not formally a public inquiry, something that's basically the same thing of similar type of import, putting similar type of importance into it. And this week we've had a whole, new round of foreign interference. I mean, I say to foreign interference, I'll get to that in detail later on, but it's not foreign interference, of course. It's not even really about Russia anymore. They even downgraded Russia. This is a real full-on. It's China, 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 China. The Globe on Friday had a big front page. This is the front page about the minister, the taking 4 months, the public safety minister taking 4 months to okay this very, very extreme thesis, getting a court okay to have this really extreme monitoring of the phone, the computer, the email, I think the right to break into his house, of Michael Chan, who's a power player, has been a power player in Liberal circles in Ontario, in the predominantly Chinese area of Toronto. And the Globe is making this out to really how, this is egregious that the Liberal government, the minister took 4 months to okay this. I'm guessing the reason for this was because, of course, he is somebody who is an influential person, and he's an influential person in Liberal circles. So I have no doubt that the minister there was a partisan element to taking his time to make the decision. But the bigger element is the fact that they don't trust CSIS, and they shouldn't trust CSIS, and they shouldn't trust CSIS that there's been long-standing CSIS dubious claims. There's a whole history of CSIS and China, and the minister taking 4 months to do due diligence on this. I don't particularly see a problem with that. But it is fitting into this narrative of of the liberals being soft on Chinese interference. But when you get down into the specifics, there's very little there. And that the National Post had this big headline story about the Sino-Canadian Cultural Center that I talked about a few weeks ago. I went to their press conference a couple of weeks ago. Last couple of months, they've just been under total assault because they're claiming that they're this Chinese police station. This comes from an NGO in Spain that made this allegation, began this whole process. And the National Post reported, I think it was on Thursday or Friday, all about how this RCMP probe continues into this. It's been around for half a century. I know people who were the former heads of this group. It's just this total witch hunt. They have no idea what they're being accused of. There's the RCMP, as of with the press conference at least, which is 2 months into this investigation, the RCMP had talked to a couple staff members. That's it. No, they have no idea what the details or the specifics of this. But this process continues. The New York Times had this story that I thought was funny about this sort of generational divide over Montana. Montana has become the first state to actually pass legislation saying they're going to ban TikTok. And they're talking about the generational divide and all these like 18 and 19-year-old Montanans and how they're all on TikTok and they just don't get it. Like, how is this going to work? How is it going to be banned from my phone? They don't seem to understand it. They're confused about the geopolitics or the politics of this. And they quote this person, which I thought about immediately when I heard about the Montana issue, is that this person's like, there's no important global politics taking place in Montana. So this whole business of TikTok, like getting the private information of Montanaites, people in Montana, and like sending it back to the Chinese government is just completely farcical, right? Like, okay, maybe, California, New York City, Washington, DC, okay, you can but Montana, I mean, come on. And it just speaks to like how much this is just this like Sinophobia of like, right-wing Republican kind of whatever. And, but they've done it. They've banned. The ban's supposed to come into effect at the end of the year. I guess there are some legal challenges and stuff like that. But and expect that this is going to move. This is going to move north, right? If we look at this trajectory of these things, this starts usually in the U.S., often in the more sort of Republican areas, trickles, and then next thing you know, you're banning Huawei, you're banning they've already banned TikTok on like, the Montreal School Board. The teachers of the Montreal School Board on their phones, they can't have TikTok, etc. Now, on the China file, there was a further confirmation of this angle I've talked about a number of times about this divide within the ruling class and the military industrial complex types versus the sort of a sector of the just capitalists, but often the worst capitalists, like the head of Barrick Gold, Robert Friedland from Ivanhoe Mining Company and stuff like that. But Terence Corcoran in the Financial Post, the business section of the National Post, Terence Corcoran's a long-standing, like hard-line neoliberal ideologue. He hasn't been writing as much, I haven't seen him as much in recent years, but he has this piece titled "Keep Politics Out of Canada-China Trade." And this is I'm with Terence Corcoran. This is maybe one of the few times. This is a climate denier. This is a total hard line right-wing ideologue, but he's reflecting the sort of neoliberal element of Canada's ruling class, of business class that just wants profits, and he's pushing back against this sort of anti-China dynamic that I think is driven by the U.S. empire, military-industrial complex, intelligence apparatus kind of elements of Canadian foreign policy. The foreign minister Joly, Le Devoir, had a story about the Americans have deepened their military ties with Philippines, with Marcos, the new Marcos government. Got rights to 4 more bases. It's all part of this, China containment policy. And Le Devoir reported an article, so un rapprochement stratégique entre le Canada et les Philippines. So a strategic, closer strategic ties between Canada and the Philippines. There's not a whole lot of details, but there's going to be a bit more sort of military relations. So this is Canada following that process the Americans have been pushing, and we're seeing that all across with the Indo-Pacific strategy, further deepening that. And the G7 that just took place in Japan, in large part, it actually was really all about sort of target China, and the Japanese government really pushed that, except that then I think Zelensky kind of ended up taking away a little bit of some of that kind of messaging. But of course, the climate crisis is driven away from the headlines, right? The climate crisis is pushed down in this focusing on China at the G7, very much, obviously, unfortunately. So it's not only problematic because it's about moving towards greater conflict with China, but it's also what other issues that are more important that are pushed aside. Journal de Montréal had this big kind of multi-page series, and one of the articles on China, and one of the articles was titled La formidable influence de la Chine au Canada, so the formidable influence of China in Canada. And you see this and you sort of say, when you really think about this, the whole foreign interference thing, so much of it is actually defensive. Okay, so the Michael Chong stuff, the conservative MP that the CISA said that after he sponsored the Uyghur resolution in 2021, that they investigated his family that he has in Hong Kong. And obviously, if that's true, or if they did intimidate, it's kind of unclear if they just investigated or they intimidated. It's all very vague in what's actually happened. I completely believe that the Chinese would look into Canadian politicians that may have family in Hong Kong or China. I absolutely believe that would happen, that Chinese diplomats would do that. That just makes complete sense. I've seen Global Affairs. I did a talk in Ottawa about the Jewish National Fund like 13 years ago. I got access to information, somebody on the JNF, and they talked about me speaking of this and circulated around within Global Affairs. So, obviously that's government agencies are looking into individuals, these kind of things. And I wouldn't surprise me if they would go to the point of if they thought there was some way of getting at Chong through his family in Hong Kong to even try to do that. That doesn't seem outside of the realm of realistic. But nonetheless, so leaving that aside for a second, just the whole kind of like the broader question of like this Chinese influence, if you actually look at this, it's overwhelmingly defensive from a Chinese perspective, at least. Well, how they see this is that the Canadian government is intervening in their internal affairs. They're putting this Uyghur resolution, calling it a genocide, trying to lay the groundwork for further intervention. Same thing with regard, they would make the same claim with regards to Hong Kong. They obviously would make the same thing with regards to Tibet, even Taiwan, right? So from the Chinese, but certainly with regards to Uyghur and Tibet, which is within current no dispute Chinese territory, they see this as foreign interference. And so it's not to, again, it wouldn't be to justify if this is correct that Chinese officials did try to intimidate Chong's family in Hong Kong. It's not to exculpate that, but it is important to kind of like look at that kind of context, how China would see this, and they obviously China has now become a formidable economic force in the world. It still has a GDP per capita that's way lower than Canada, US, but it has become probably the biggest economy in the world if you do a proper purchasing power parity and some of that. But it's important to look at this from the kind of broader context that China sees all this, which is the whole history, right? Of being intervened. So I pointed out that in Ottawa, one of the most important streets in Ottawa is Elgin Street, right? The Lord Elgin Hotel, right off of Parliament Hill. Well, who was Lord Elgin? Lord Elgin was the guy who sacked the palace to humiliate the Chinese in 1860, right? So we still celebrate. He was the British High Commissioner that, that was part of breaking up China at the time, what they called the century of humiliation. So we celebrate this guy who's, viewed as playing an important role in shaming Chinese history for a century. Burned the palace as being pointed out in the chat. Even the missionaries, Globe and Mail article from a week 10 days ago talked about the Canada's missionary history and framing this in a positive light. Well, Canadian missionaries that were in China in the late 1800s, they were part of the colonial process, obviously. If you look at, Canada's role in Hong Kong and helping the British keep control of Hong Kong, during World War II, we send all these troops. I mean, it becomes a disaster. A couple, 2,000 Canadian troops, half of them, I think, die. The total disaster in the effort to keep Hong Kong in British hands from the Japanese. But then after, we help, reassert British colonial rule in Hong Kong after World War II. 1949, we sent naval vessels, right? We were supporting the opposition to Mao's forces, those who flee to Taiwan. The Korean War of 1950, right? That's in part about fighting China, and then obviously we refused to recognize China for more than 20 years at the UN and diplomatically. So there's this context from a Chinese perspective, at least, of even if you look at in the here and now, they see what they're doing is pushing back against efforts at foreign interference with the Uyghur question, Tibet, Hong Kong, and even of course with regards to Taiwan. So that's context I do think we need to keep in mind. So when Journal de Montréal talks about the formidable Chinese influence in Canada, I think we need to think a little bit more broadly. Israel continues with its provocations, its violence. 3 more Palestinians were killed today. Their Flag Day, where they chants of death to the Arabs. Ben-Gvir, the security minister, provocative visit that even the Americans criticized today with the Temple Mount. So that process of these, far-right Jewish supremacist forces that have taken the Israeli government and are just deepening already the apartheid and racist system is remarkable. But yet today we have a walk for apartheid in Toronto with all kinds of top politicians boasting about how they were walking for apartheid this morning, all over Twitter, celebrating their racism. The Israeli embassy, this was an interesting one. The Israeli embassy had this conference they hosted at the start of the week titled Canadian Summit for Israel Jewish Affairs, the Next 75 Years. And the conference is interesting for a whole bunch of levels. First of all, this is the Israeli embassy openly mobilizing domestic groups to push its agenda. I thought we were amidst a big foreign interference brouhaha in Canada, right? Bunch of top politicians show up at this foreign interference conference. So that's interesting. Obviously, the Israeli ambassador, the Israeli consul generals in Montreal, Toronto are there. And there's a couple of the participants that I just thought were too funny, their participation. Okay, so first of all, Noah Zatzman. Okay, people familiar remember Noah Zatzman, the Green Party, the advisor to the former leader of the Green Party, Annamie Paul, who was really the person responsible for the disintegration of the Green Party when, amidst the May 2021 burst of Israeli violence and ethnic cleansing in East Jerusalem, when some the MPs criticized what Israel was doing, some called it apartheid, some of them decent statements and some of them not that good of statements, but criticized what Israel was doing, and he called them all anti-Semites. So he had the top advisor, senior advisor to the leader, calling the 3 members of parliament from that party in the House of Commons, calling them anti-Semites. That, of course, led to one leaving the party, crossing the floor to the Liberals. It ended up contributing to the defeat of the one in Nanaimo, and it led to Annamie Paul, the leader, just her leadership disintegrating. Now, Zatzman doubled down. He didn't just do it once on Facebook. He doubled down and he doubled down, and then he boasted about it, basically. So here you have the Israeli embassy organizing this conference in Ottawa, and they have Noah Zatzman to speak about Israel and me. I mean, like, Israel and me. I mean, how many people could speak about Israel and me? There's got to be like, hundreds, thousands in Canada, and if you want to go around the world, tens of thousands who could speak about Israel. I mean, I could speak about Israel and me. So choosing him to speak is a message, of course, right? And this is a message of thank you for what you did with the Green Party. I mean, I don't really see how you, or at minimum, or to frame it a bit more defensive, we're going to stand behind those who destroy political parties, on behalf of their perceived, in his case, on behalf of Israel. I'm not sure that what happened ended up being good for Israel, but that's a whole different discussion. So Noah Zatzman's participation I found very striking and kind of humorous. The other one was, I don't know how you pronounce her first name, Eilert Cooper. Okay, so this name, I see this thing, I kind of couldn't remember where I remember the name from. So I punched it into Google. And so she spoke at a panel headlined Anti-Zionism as the New Anti-Semitism, Defining a Unified Strategy in Combating Modern Anti-Semitism. Okay, so explicitly saying anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, okay? Straightforward. She spoke at that. Now, who is she? Well, back at the end of last year, there was at least a dozen, probably 24 articles, Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, National Post, Canadian Jewish News, everywhere, all, not just the hardline Israel supporters, but all kinds of like more liberal Zionists, and even people who weren't particularly identified with Zionism, talked about all this horrible anti-Semitism at the University of Toronto. She published this report, or actually not a report, she published an article in the Canadian Medical Journal, I believe it was, basically claiming all this anti-Semitism at the University of Toronto's medical faculty. Now, I believe I was the only person that wrote anything pushing back against this, right? I published a big, long piece in Mondoways. I went through it. When she was appointed in this position as a senior advisor on anti-Semitism at the Temerity School of Medicine at University of Toronto, she was appointed in the aftermath of the May 2021 protests, right? So basically, there's all this like pro-Palestinian activism. Some Jewish faculty claimed this was anti-Semitism, and they made a big, kerfuffle about this. And the way the administration tried to, deal with this, they announced these special envoys to look at anti-Semitism, and then later on a special envoy on Islamophobia. And they clearly appointed this fanatic into this position of a special envoy on anti-Semitism, who then, quite frankly, burned the Medical Faculty Association. That's why she publishes as she left her position, because I mean, even for a pro-Israel, medical faculty administrator to have just dozens of articles saying this, a hotbed of anti-Semitism in medical faculty, that's bad for the institution. And now, to me, this is just her mask is off, right? This was always clear to me if you looked at her report closely. All these claims of these sort of like a little bit ambiguous claim of this professor at a luncheon that she was having with somebody, talks about Jewish people in a certain way, this or that she kind of, she was very vague in all her claims, but she didn't directly associate them to Israel. Now, to me, this was just, it was already pretty clear to me looking at this, that was the case, but now it's just, I mean, when she's now going to go speak at a panel titled Anti-Semitism or Anti-Zionism is Anti-Semitism, come on, this is what we know what she was doing. And in fact, this whole exercise, all these articles in the papers were just anti-Palestinian racism under the guise of anti-Semitism or combating anti-Semitism. Another person, this was funny. The other person who was at the Israel conference that I thought was really funny was Robert Fife. Robert Fife is the Globe and Mail reporter, the head of the Ottawa bureau for the Globe and Mail, who's been the main person pushing the foreign interference, right? The Chinese foreign interference. So, like, just imagine, or it's like completely unimaginable to have Robert Fife speak to host a panel, or he moderated a panel, to moderate a panel at a conference organized by the Chinese embassy that was about getting its domestic groups to strategize with domestic groups to advance its agenda within Canada. But clearly he doesn't really care about foreign interference. He cares about a specific foreign interference, which is the U.S. empire telling him he wants to whip up concern about Chinese interference, and the U.S. empire is not too concerned about Israeli interference. Hence, we have no problem on that front. The Canadian Jewish News published has a story about this new group titled Network of Engaged Canadian Academics. And they interview these two profs, one from University of Ottawa and one from Carleton. And the one is the head of the Jewish studies, I believe it was at Carleton. And they set up this network of engaged Canadian academics designed to defend academics who are challenged in one way or another for being pro-apartheid. Or that the woman said the motivation of setting it up was that she was trying to bring her students to Israel, and there was some criticism of that. And the other motivation is that faculty associations have been signing or opposing support for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's anti-Palestinian definition of anti-Semitism. So basically they're saying is that there's lots of groups designed for students, like sort of pushing back against pro-Palestinian activism, but there isn't a network in Canada of academics, specifically just for academics. And apparently there's a similar type organization in the US that they're modeling after. And so I'm doing this piece that talks about the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. A bit more than a decade ago, they set up this scholarship program in response to the Jenny Petto, who had this thesis where she basically, which calls Israel an apartheid state, but she basically says that Canadian Jews are like white privilege, and this just led to a huge storm. Back in 2010, she published she passed her as a master's thesis, I believe. She, of course, she's Jewish, but they, of course, claimed she was anti-Semitic and blah 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 blah. Well, at that time, the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center set up a scholarship that they explicitly said was in response to this thesis, and it was going to go to like students that were saying Israel's great and Israel's wonderful and whatever, right? It was explicitly pushing back against this thesis, this critical thesis. And then recently I was told about the broader plan or broader scholarships. And so the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center has a whole bunch of scholarships that they basically give out to pro-Israel students. And it's a little bit, not totally clear in the language, but it's almost, you could frame it almost as like a spying kind of operation, right? You will give money to students that are willing to like report back to us on any pro-Palestinian activism happening on their campus. They, of course, frame it as, anti-Semitism. But then if you look at what they consider anti-Semitism, calling Israel an apartheid state is, of course, called, considered anti-Semitism. And so there's a whole network of these different kind of initiatives. The most important one is the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, or CAMRA. And they offer $1,500 US to students who, and a trip to Boston for this conference, free paid trip to Boston conference, for students who basically do a series of anti-Palestinian things on their campus. So there's a whole network of different groups that are focused on students. The Hillels do this, and a number of other, Israel on Campus, who basically work to monitor pro-Palestinian activism. And now we have this addition to also help out academics to monitor and push back against pro-Palestinian activism on campus. With regards to the horrors in Ukraine, I'm seeing all kind. I think we're going in some we're going further down in the wrong direction, scary direction. Obviously, we've seen what happened in Bakhmut. That's just a destruction. It looks like Russia has now got control of this, but the level of horror is almost beyond belief. Today, it looks like the Ukrainians led some, they're calling it Russian partisans, but they took a Russian village, so they're crossing the border into Russia. There's, of course, the announcement of the F-16s. That's further amping things up. That were announced, the G7, Americans okaying F-16s being sent, and a whole bunch more weaponry. So I think we are just sort of, steadily kind of going up that escalatory ladder. It's all happening now with, kind of less and less even seeming concern about it, but that is where we are going. In this context, a couple days ago, I went to interview. I thought I was going to try to interview the head of the new co-leader of the Green Party. Am I sharing a screen? Yeah. Okay, you see this here screen. Okay, so that's.
Hi, it's Evening with hi, right? It's Evening with hi, right? Thank you. Can I just ask you a quick question about? I know exactly what I'm going to ask you about. Green support sending weapons to Ukraine. Does the Green Party support sending weapons to Ukraine? Does the Green Party support sending weapons to Ukraine? I know exactly who you are. I'm not interested in your question. I'm not interested in what you represent right now. And I will not be answering your question. If you won't, you're running to be an MP and you won't answer questions. I'm sorry. You're running to be an MP and you won't answer questions. You're running to represent the Green Party in the House of Commons, but you won't answer a question about whether the Greens support sending weapons. I'm not a journalist. I don't write articles. Wow. So what journalists are acceptable journalists? Is it only if they're only at corporate outlets? No, sorry, is it only if they're in the corporate outlets? Thank you for being here. If you want you're actually not going to answer questions. You're just refusing to answer any question. Exactement. Exactement. Ma réponse. Ta réponse, c'est que je vais répondre à aucune de tes questions. Pourquoi pas mes questions? Why won't you answer my question? No, but Jonathan, why won't you answer my question? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You could have told me. No, I'm sorry. No, I'm not asking you to leave. No, you're.
So that's the co-leader of the Greens, and Jonathan Pedno, I believe, probably pronounce it. Later on, he will call me pro-Russian activism, pro-Russian lies, and pro-Russian propaganda. Those are quotes. And then he would say that I was trying to intimidate him. Say, I'm not intimidated by you, which was interesting. He's a pretty good sized guy. I mean, I'm bigger than him. This was just, I bumped, as I'm going to the thing, he's outside the venue, talking to somebody. I wait there for, I don't know, 30 seconds as he finishes his conversation. And then, as you saw, he just he recognized my name and was like, "No, nothing to do with this guy." And the reason I was asking the question is that this seems to go against the Green Party constitution, which is pacifist. The previous leader of the party, right before Russia's invasion and just after, put out three different statements saying they didn't support sending weapons. They supported other elements. Now, when Elizabeth May and Penot became the leaders a few months ago, 4 months ago, something like that, they seem to have shifted policy. And but they're a little bit vague about it. They haven't stated, like, so this Canadian CBC interview where they say they support what Canada's doing, but they never come out explicit and say, we support sending tanks, right? They say we support what Canada's doing. Now, Canada, of course, has sent more than $2 billion in weapons and sent tanks and surface to air missiles and et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to ask that. And I don't know if he just really didn't want to answer that question. He understood it, or it was mostly just about me and he thought about me beforehand, or, was concerned. I don't know if it was, the question specifically or primarily me. But nonetheless, he refused to answer any of this stuff. Which I was actually stunned. I really, this was maybe the of all my interventions, quite frankly, I was going there with a total different angle, maybe more like different concern, because he's been to Ukraine twice. He was just there, which I think was maybe partly in reaction to Dmitry Lascaris going to Russia. I'm not sure, but he was just there. And he had been there early on. I think he was with Human Rights Watch before he became leader of the party, and I'm not sure exactly what he was doing. So I actually expected it more of like a kind of a higher level discussion. Like it was going to be, I was actually more like concerned. I got to make sure I've thought through, what I'm going to say and whatever, because he, unlike lots of other people, he actually sort of will know. He'll know the NATO line, he'll know the Ukrainian government line, and whatever, right? And so, but he took like just the complete like opposite of just like, wow, you are just outside of bounds, kind of whatever. So I really was genuinely stunned, walking away from the whole thing. Now I posted this, what you saw, the tagline, to Twitter, and a University of Victoria professor, Tamara Krashenko, responded by saying, Eve Engler, you should be honest about what you're advocating for here. Genocide. And I'm like, what? I'm asking the head of the Green Party if he supports sending weapons, $2 billion in weapons, while Canada opposes negotiations. And now I'm supporting genocide? So I say, like, what? Excuse me? And she doubles down. And she says, somebody, she's looks like she's an assistant prof, public administration. This is kind of like her domain. And she doubles down and she says, you're saying the Ukrainians don't have the right to resist. And I'm like, well, no, I've never said that. That's a complete lie. I've referred to it as a legal invasion, and implicit in calling it a legal invasion is that Ukrainians have a right to resist. And I've actually even said that publicly. I haven't said it, been written that many times that, Ukrainians have the right to resist, but I've been asked that in discussions. And I've said, yes, I've absolutely never said Ukrainians don't have the right to resist. They completely have the right to resist. And then, so she changes it to, well, you're opposing Canada sending weapons. So now the right to resist and Canada sending weapons is the same thing. Well, most of the world opposes sending weapons. Right? The climate in this country is so crazy on this issue that if you question sending weapons while opposing negotiations, you are now saying Ukrainians have to just roll over and be genocided by the Russians. It's just completely nuts, right? Most of the world, including many allies, US allies like South Korea and Japan, been totally allergic to sending weapons. So this is just, this is the climate where we're at, and just seeing this professor kind of lay this out, that if you're not like 100% behind the whatever amount of Canadian weapons that the Canadian US government decide to send, you support genocide. And this is the whole question. I've variations of this have come up before, and I always kind of wonder, like, okay, so if I don't support sending nuclear weapons to Ukraine, I'm therefore supporting genocide. No, I mean, take that logic. Like, where's the line? What, like, is it F-16? Is it F-35? Is it like what weapon? Is it an aircraft carrier? Like, what is the weapon that if you don't support sending that weapon, therefore you are telling the Ukrainians to just, submit to the genociders, right? Now, on top of all this, of course, Russia's not committing a genocide. Even if they were committing a genocide, I still wouldn't be supporting the genocide if by saying I don't support sending weapons and want negotiations, but they're not even committing a genocide anyways. That's just like kind of silly NATO kind of propaganda. That doesn't mean it's not brutal, right? That doesn't mean it's not brutal. It doesn't mean what Russia is doing is not, contrary to international law. Now, another development in this kind of context is this event. A month ago, this community center in Montreal blocked this event that was being the Montréal pour la Paix on Ukraine. They booked the room, then they canceled the room booking, and now the community center. This was now planned for this Saturday, the Sunday, the 28th, at a community center on the other part of the city, other side of the city. And this is a community center that organizes the anarchist, or that hosts the anarchist book fair, which happens to be on this weekend. So when the event is happening, they have the anarchist book fair. They've been having it there for a decade. Previous of these anarchist book fairs have been at this community center. One year they organized a march into Westmount, the wealthy area that's not that far from where this is. And they marched up to like mansions of like people like Jean Charest, wealthy Canadian capitalists. It led to, riot squad, sort of minor little riot and whatnot. So the anarchist book fair has been like, there's almost certainly some of the materials there that promote armed resistance and whatnot. Okay, but this community center has defended that, has continued to have the anarchist book for many years, to their credit. But they can't have a talk with myself, University of Montreal prof, and Alex Terrell, the leader of the Green Party of Quebec, about Ukraine. And the rationale they're claiming, they took the money. The payment for the room was made. They sent the money back, and the rationale was that they have some language classes that include Ukrainian refugees, and therefore, who knows? But that's the rationale they are giving, which is just like totally wild. We're going ahead with it. So if you're in Montreal, come out 2 p.m. on May 28th, whether they let us have the room or not. We're going ahead with it. We'll do it outside in the park. It's a nice park. So if people, show up, but this gets to Canada and this question. And really, the more I think about it, the more I look into it, Canada is the most crazy country in the world on the NATO proxy war. And I'm not saying that maybe, Poland and Latvia, that it may not be more crazy in terms of their kind of repressive domestic environments, but they're on the front line. They're right there. We're like there's no security threat. Like there's no plausible security threat you could possibly imagine in Canada. We are so far away, right? Geographically, we have no MP, right? None of the Greens, none of the Bloc Québécois, none of the NEP, no MP in the House of Commons, right? Jonathan Perrenot, quite frankly, he's going to win like 10. This is a by-election. He's running in his by-election for a seat in NDG Westmount. He's going to win 10 or 15% of the vote. He's not going to a shot in hell of winning this seat. There's no way he's going to be in the House of Commons. He's not even in the House of Commons, and he has to take extremist language on this question of the NATO proxy war. We have no MP. In Britain, Jeremy Corbyn's come out with very strong, clear, good language about, you're just fueling the war. You're not talking about peace. You have European Union MPs like that Mike Wallace, and there's that woman, I see a lot, Irish MPs on Twitter. I see them a lot making statements, good language, more weapons, never talk about peace. You're just prolonging it, etc. Bringing out some of the class dynamics. You in the States, you have Jill Stein, former leader of the Green Party, the presidential candidate for the Green Party. You have Donald Trump, and you have a big segment of the Republican right. Obviously, you have Lula, Brazil internationally. This delegation of 6 different African countries, led by the South Africans, to go and look for a peace accord of some sort. All around internationally. Now, in Canada, what do you have? The most prominent individual who's challenging some of this is Maxime Bernier. right? The far right former Harper foreign minister. And then you go, what's after that? You have like me and Dimitri Lascaris. I mean, like there's nobody with like any, honestly, nobody with like any prominence raising questions on this stuff. It's completely completely wild, the political climate, where, you know, union, you know, in April, mid-April, you have the union aligned, community group aligned, community center in Montreal bans a talk. Then you have a community center on the other side of the city that, you know, hosts the anarchist book fair. No, you can't have this Ukraine talk. That's really scary. Talking about peace is, you know, way outside of bounds. And so, you know, to get to the why question, why is Canada so crazy on this issue? I think that there's, you know, two main explanations. One is Canada has been at the heart of NATO since before NATO was created, as part of creating NATO. And the other simple answer is the, you know, anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalism. Canada has really been a hub of that for decades. It's been generating that and fostering that for, you know, certainly since World War II. And there's a, you know, very organized and powerful ideological kind of movement there. So obviously we have to challenge that and break out of that. I've gone on for way too long, so if anybody has any comments and questions, they can go ahead, and I will make you a co-host, Laura. Go ahead, Laura.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I was just wondering, so in the last week, I think it was, that the Eisenhower Media Network, you know, they put that large-scale full-page ad in the New York Times, you know, for ceasefire negotiations, and it was pretty balanced ad. I mean, it certainly condemned the Russian invasion, but it also really spoke heavily about the provocation, and it had two good maps showing, anyway, two good diagrams actually showing how Russia is encircled, and how it would be if US was encircled by coming through Canada and coming through Mexico. And I was just wondering if that letter or that ad got any notice in mainstream media. It got a lot of in non-mainstream media here. I don't know about mainstream, but I'm wondering in Canada, did it get any notice?
Yeah, it got. I didn't see any notice in Canada, with the exception I saw some, you know, anti-war article, responsible statecraft, stuff like that. I did a day or two after I saw it. I did a Google search to see if there was actually any attention for it in like mainstream US or Canadian. I didn't see anything. But no, I mean, and that's another example of the Canada. I haven't seen any like former Canadian, you know, it was signed by former generals and colonels and stuff, the U.S. military, and then also top Wilkerson and top former advisors to, you know, defense ministry or whatever. And I haven't seen any equivalent to that in Canada either, right? Like any former Canadian military or former Canadian security kind of people come out and question Canada's role. It's just like a further example, so that, you know, there is some of that in the US. It's just, there's none of, I mean, it's remarkable how little there is in this country on this issue. Yeah.
Yeah. So Nadia has her hand up next, and then Laurel. Go ahead, Nadia, unmute, please. Nadia Alexander, can you unmute? No, you're still muted, Nadia. Can she unmute?
Okay. All right. So thank you, Eve. I'm glad that you quoted some guy who's from the right wing, but you still quoted him, because unfortunately, the left now has a habit of demonizing anybody from the right, even if the person from the right is saying the same thing that we're saying. Demonize, and you know, don't even quote them or have anything to do with them, which is something that I oppose. Second, there's John Pilger from Australia, and Chris Hedges, and what's the other one called? There are very famous people from the US who are speaking out against the sending arms and speaking out about what happened with the Minsk agreement, and it's NATO that has, that has reneged on the Minsk agreement. But I just wanted to say that why aren't we blaming the arms industry? Because these are the oligarchs who have hijacked our governments and are making them like puppets do what they want. We should be not just attacking our government, but we should also be attacking the lords, the barons, who are using our governments as puppets, and they're not even satisfied with influencing governments. They now want to be the global government. So this is very scary, and we should be attacking the oligarchs of war, the warmongers who are behind the more wars they have, the happier they are.
Well, I mean, it's really concrete, right? In the mid-90s, the arms companies in the US set up it's called like the Committee for NATO Expansion, right? They put like tens of millions of dollars. I believe they mentioned that in the ad that the Eisenhower Institute put out. They put up tens of millions of dollars in money to lobby for NATO expansion, and so that's a background to the horrors we're seeing, and many other examples of that. But the problem is just to Maud Barlow, the former head of the Council of Canadians, who I know you have done lots of stuff with and have lots of respect for. Maud Barlow is a complete and utter fanatic on this issue. Absolutely, totally NATO, right?
It's hard to understand, Eve. It's hard to understand what has happened to the left. The left now, you can't differentiate it from the right. They've gone bonkers, the left has gone bonkers.
And so they don't see the arms industry as a bad thing, right? Early on in the Financial Times had this story early on after Russia's invasion, and they basically the story was that this is good for the arms industry. The obvious way was there's always contracts coming in, but they were like, that's only part of it. The other part of it is now like arms. They were going so there was the ESG rules of responsible investing rules and whatever were excluding arms companies, but that was all reversed. Right now, the arms industry is viewed in this positive light because it's defending and whatever. Right? So yeah, of course, the arms industry has been very done well by this. But I think at the core of all this, and on both sides, but we focus on our side because at the core of this is that what happened is good internationalist, humanist people let the geopolitics people determine things, and we didn't pay sufficient attention to the these geopolitical games that Canadian government, American government, NATO were playing in Eastern Europe, and they just kept pushing, and on the other side you have a government that's also a militaristic. The people who run Russia have those types of kind of inclinations as well, and the result of that is just horror. So yeah, I mean, it's funny. I often think of that when people. I feel bad on a personal level. I wrote about some of the stuff, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago. I did bits of it even in the Black Book back in 2009. But I personally feel bad for not having kind of fully got my head around how kind of damaging Canadian policy was. I didn't follow the Maidan ouster of Yanukovych properly. I should have been writing stuff, detailing all that. Around that time. I didn't do that until, quite frankly, only 16, 18 months ago, where I really went back and looked at what was going on and what Canada had done. So yeah, we let the geopolitical empire people run the ship, and who they're working for to a large extent is the arms companies, and they just kept making decision after decision to, put us towards a conflict, and then they're just keeping going. I mean, it's a very logical progression. So how do we stop that? How do we end that? I don't know, but we certainly, the starting point is to talk about it, and the starting point is to have events like Laurel is organizing here that it's being canceled. Go ahead, Laurel.
Yeah, I want you to know that I posted 35 posters around the center where we're going to be on Saturday. I decided I was not going to hold back on them. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
My question is, what are they going to do? What is Anita Anand and Trudeau and Jolie and so on? What are they going to say when Ukraine loses, when Russia succeeds in its special military operation and practically devastates Ukraine, and when world trade is completely reoriented in a completely different direction towards the east, and China and Russia and India and Brazil and so on are going to become very big players. I'm curious to know what you think their narrative is going to be. They're not going to say they were wrong.
Never.
They're not going to admit that. But my God, they made a blooper. They've made a really bad judgment about all of this. It's very unintelligent. And
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I totally agree with that. I think that they have weakened Russia. I think that, to me, is straightforward. I think that I saw a graph today from the Americans have clearly brought Western Europe. They've strengthened NATO. They've brought Western Europe much more under their boot. Part of what they wanted. So I think that's happened. I think there's no doubt Ukraine's already been. I mean, there's no, obviously, even if Ukraine was to get with the most maximalist things that they're saying, we're going to liberate all our territory, whatever, Ukraine still would have lost. If clearly, I mean, it's just disastrous, right? But then the chance of them getting that is close to nil. They're not getting Crimea back for sure, and probably aren't getting back, much of the Donbass, and it's more likely that Kyiv falls than they get Crimea. That's for sure. Yeah, I don't see this as being like, I think that, the China question, like, so China how does this play for China? I think China is this is causing a bit of a problem for China vis-a-vis Western Europe. And the US definitely wants that. And so that's, so yes, this is making Russia more dependent on China, which would be good for China, but Western Europe's a way bigger economy than Russia. Now, Russia has commodities that are very important for China, but yeah, I don't know that this is I definitely see scenarios where this is good for the US has done well by this, and I would say, to me, that would be the more likely kind of outcome.
okay, because the US will have more control over Europe.
They'll have more control over Europe. NATO's stronger. Russia's weakened. I mean, I don't see any way around that. Russia's not done well. I mean, 15 months in now, and obviously Russia would have been. They haven't done as bad as the media here says, but obviously the Russian government, Russian military would have wanted this to, way faster than this. Yeah.
Well, I don't know whether other people feel this way, but I don't think Russia's that weak. I think their economy is doing well, and they're selling a lot of commodities. They're even selling their oil to Europe at a higher price because it's being traded sort of illegally. They're making money hand over fist, I think.
There's no doubt that the plan, I think that I don't know that it was a plan. I don't know that the Russians plan to win quickly, right? I don't know for sure that even the effort to take Kyiv was not, in at least part, just a diversion, right, to the other military objectives. It makes sense to me that you would try to take Kyiv, and you think maybe you might get it, but as much as that, you're trying to just divert from other objectives. That's a plausible. I still think that's plausible. I don't know enough about military strategy to say that confidently one way or another. But I think there's no doubt that Russia wanted this to go quicker than it's going. That's, they didn't want, right? Now, simultaneously, the business of the argument that we were going to collapse Russia's economy, and then they would feel the economic pressure to withdraw or whatever. That's clearly hasn't gone to NATO planning as well. That's both of those things to me are pretty clear. So yes, Russia's not done that bad economically, but it's it's depleted the Russian military. It's led to people dying. It's led to
other questions. Hands up. So I do think we need to give other people a chance.
Yeah.
Okay.
Emily Catherine, can you unmute, please?
Sorry, go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I've got a wayward dog here. Yeah, I'd just like to mention that the neglect of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace has had a long held position on NATO going back to the 1960s. So just I know, Yves, sometimes you feel like you're alone, but that vehicle has been around for decades. And the other point I wanted to make is reinforce what Natty was mentioning about the left-right conundrum. And I think, over the decades and being from a family who marched on Parliament Hill in the 1950s, et cetera, where is the peace movement going? Where is the war machine going? And I think that notion of, and from my perspective, it's economically, the right and the left will say, or drawing from the right and the left, it'll say, this is not working, right? The money going to the military, even for the most dramatic capitalist, and wants to make money in other ways besides the military, they'll come to our side, right? So we have to keep our mind open and not, keep our mind open to the left, right? And then from my perspective, it's because economically, the money that's being drained into the military. And this is what the public doesn't know. This is what Canadians don't know. I noticed some here, someone said 32% of Canadians don't support Canadian intervention in Ukraine or whatever. And I think that would even, that figure would even be higher if Canadians knew budgetary aspects of how much money goes into the military, both nationally and internationally, globally as well. Regardless of where people are on the right-left spectrum. So that's what I had to say.
Yeah, I think that the stat has to do with sending arms. There was a poll, I think 2 months ago, maybe on the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion, that showed that I think it's only 32 or 33% of Canadians supported sending more arms.
Okay, that's what it was. Yeah.
People generally support Ukraine. They're asked, like, do you support Ukraine? Do you support Russia? And it's like very overwhelming that they support Ukraine, but what they want Canada to do in that is much more complicated than that. And now, counter that, there's polling that's just coming out that shows that the public is increasingly on board with the whole 2% of GDP military spending to the NATO, so-called the NATO target there. But then the polling also confirms, which is this long-standing polling, that when people are willing to say that we should get up to the NATO target, but then when you start doing it next to other options like more spending on healthcare or more spending on whatever pensions or environment,
exactly.
Then they don't actually want more military spending. But I do believe, and the poll also showed that support for NATO has gone up in recent years. It's still out of whack with what you get in the media, right? The media, you only have support for NATO in the media, right? That's like 99.9% of all stories are pro NATO. There's 0.1% 1.01% that are anti-NATO. Yet the public, there's still, 10, I forget the exact number, but 10 to 15% of people who oppose NATO, and then others that are ambiguous and whatever. But yeah, so the pro-NATO sentiment has gone up. Yeah, I don't really have.
You know what, the propaganda is such that that's like being against motherhood, right?
Yeah, no, of course.
If you're against NATO, you're against motherhood. And I think that idea of, articulating where the money could be spent elsewhere is what will turn people's heads.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the strongest. But that's the if you don't have an organized anti-war movement, kind of putting those ideas out there, then that's
Yeah. But I do ask people to look at the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace website. There's a lot of good information on it.
Yeah.
Okay, the last question is Nadia has her hand up again. Nadia, do you have another question? And that can be our final question. Can you unmute yourself, Nadia? Or
Okay. Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay, I just wanted to mention that Jeffrey Sachs, also one of the historians and very important pundits in the States, is also against the Ukraine war, and he was one of the top supporters of the American government, but yeah, now he's talking sense. I just wanted to mention also that yesterday I watched religiously 60 Minutes on CBS, and yesterday there was an excellent investigation that I think the 60 Minutes has spent years investigating, and apparently they're spending the defense industry is costing the taxpayer. In other words, they are charging the American government the quadrupling what the actual cost of the arms are, the planes, whatever the defense armaments they are buying. They hike up the prices to an incredible. If you get a chance to watch the video, it's quite enlightening. And to go back to Russia and China and the way we look at other countries, this idea of polarization is so far removed from what happened after the Second World War, when countries stood together against acid rain, and when they stood together against nuclear weapons, for example. We should go back to this idea that all peoples deserve dignity. All peoples deserve to live in peace, not just the Occident, not just the United States and the West. All countries deserve to live in peace. So one country should not have hegemony. And I think the reason that Canada and NATO and the United States is panicking now is because the economics are shifting, and the United States will no longer be the boss, and nobody elected them to be the boss and the police of the world anyway. So I think maybe things will change. I hope they will.
Yeah, I mean, I do too, and I agree with a lot of that. I don't think that we can. Our odds of dealing with the climate crisis or mitigating the absolute most devastating element of the climate crisis are not very high right now. But when we have these horrible great power rivalries and warfare, the odds go down even further. So we need that internationalism. But if that's it for the questions, it's past 7 o'clock. So thanks everyone. Same place.